A lighthouse stands alone in the Atlantic Ocean, not marking safe passage but concealing something far stranger. A bathysphere descends through crushing darkness, carrying you toward a city that should not exist. The year is 1960, and you're about to discover that humanity's grandest experiments in philosophy and governance do not simply fail, they drown. BioShock presents us with Rapture, an underwater metropolis built on the radical principles of Objectivism, and Columbia, a floating city suspended by American exceptionalism taken to its most extreme conclusion. Both were utopias in theory. Both became nightmares in practice. But the question that echoes through dripping corridors and cloud-swept plazas is not simply what went wrong, but whether these failures were inevitable from the moment their foundations were laid. The story begins not with the cities themselves, but with the men who dreamed them into being. Andrew Ryan and Zachary Comstock, two visionaries separated by ideology yet united by a singular belief that the world above had failed, that society needed to be rebuilt from first principles, free from the contamination of existing power structures. One descended into the ocean depths, the other ascended into the clouds. Both carried the seeds of their own destruction. What makes BioShock's narrative so compelling is its refusal to offer simple answers. This is not a story about good versus evil, but about the catastrophic consequences of ideological purity meeting human nature. It explores what happens when philosophy becomes architecture, when political theory transforms into lived reality, and when the promise of freedom curdles into the worst forms of control. The genius of the series lies in how it uses the language of video games, the mechanics of choice and agency, to interrogate the very nature of freedom itself. In a medium where players expect control, BioShock reveals that control may have been an illusion all along. The phrase, "would you kindly," becomes more than a plot twist. It becomes a mirror held up to every action we take in games, every quest we accept without question, every objective marker we follow because the game told us to. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why these cities fell, we must first understand why they were built. We must descend into the mind of Andrew Ryan, a man who looked at the world of the mid-20th century and saw only parasites and masters, a man who believed that the greatest sin was not tyranny, but mediocrity, not oppression, but the levelling force of collective thinking. Ryan's philosophy, drawn directly from the writings of Ayn Rand, proposed that human progress depended entirely on the freedom of exceptional individuals to pursue their rational self-interest without interference. No gods, no kings, only man. This was not merely a political position, but a metaphysical claim about the nature of human worth and the source of all value in the universe. In 1946, after witnessing the rise of totalitarian regimes across Europe and growing disillusioned with American politics during the New Deal era, Ryan began construction of Rapture. He gathered the world's greatest minds, artists, scientists, industrialists, and builders, promising them a place where their talents would not be shackled by government regulation, religious morality, or democratic consensus. A place where the scientist would not be bound by petty ethics, where the artist would not fear censorship, where the industrialist could build without bureaucratic interference. The city itself was a marvel of engineering and ambition. Built in a geothermal vent near Iceland, Rapture consisted of interconnected structures held together by massive Art Deco architecture, all sealed against the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. Glass tunnels offered views of the Atlantic floor. Neon signs glowed in the permanent darkness. The aesthetic was deliberately chosen, a blend of elegance and power, beauty serving as a constant reminder that this was a place for the exceptional. Every detail of Rapture's design reinforced Ryan's philosophy. There were no poor districts because poverty, in Ryan's view, was a choice made by those who refused to embrace their potential. There were no churches because faith was seen as a crutch for the weak-minded. There was no government beyond the minimal framework needed to maintain property rights and contracts. The city would regulate itself through the invisible hand of the market and the visible pursuit of excellence. But even in its golden age, before the discovery of Adam, before the Civil War, before the Splicers and the Little Sisters, Rapture contained contradictions that would eventually tear it apart. Ryan spoke of freedom but demanded absolute loyalty. He praised individual achievement but could not tolerate competition to his own vision. He built a city without gods yet positioned himself as its infallible architect. The first cracks appeared not in the infrastructure but in the social fabric. Without collective services, those who failed in Rapture's competitive environment had nowhere to turn. The poor did exist despite Ryan's denial, and they gathered in places like Pauper's Drop and Apollo Square. Artists who could not find patrons starved. Scientists whose research failed to attract funding were left destitute. To truly understand Rapture's philosophical foundations, we must examine the man behind them in greater detail. Andrew Ryan was born Andrei Ryanovsky in Russia, experiencing firsthand the Bolshevik Revolution and the transformation of his homeland into a communist state. His family's business was seized. His childhood was marked by the violence of ideological transformation. When he emigrated to America, he carried with him a deep suspicion of collective action and a burning conviction that individual liberty was the only bulwark against tyranny. Ryan's interpretation of objectivism was not merely economic but spiritual. He believed that the human being was defined by their ability to reason, to create, to transform raw material through intelligence and will. The parasites, as he called them, were those who sought to live off the efforts of others, whether through government welfare, religious charity, or democratic redistribution. In Ryan's eyes, these were not simply bad policies, but moral evils, violations of the natural order of human excellence. The phrase that would become Rapture's unofficial motto encapsulated this worldview: no gods, no kings, only man. This was a rejection not just of religious authority and political hierarchy, but of any framework that placed limits on individual achievement based on anything other than merit. Ryan envisioned a space where the only thing that mattered was what you could create, what value you could add, what genius you could unleash. His vision attracted a specific type of person: brilliant minds who felt constrained by the ethical guidelines of surface institutions, artists tired of censorship and the demands of popular taste, industrialists frustrated by labor laws and environmental regulations, scientists who wanted to push boundaries that governments and universities refused to let them cross. These were not evil people, at least not at first. They were ambitious, driven, and convinced that their individual pursuits would collectively create something greater than any planned society could achieve. The city's early years seemed to validate Ryan's philosophy. Innovation exploded in Rapture. Advances in genetics, physics, and engineering emerged at a pace that the surface world could not match. The city gleamed with prosperity. Fontaine Futuristics and Ryan Industries competed to create wonders, plasmids that could rewrite human capabilities, buildings that defied architectural convention, art that challenged every previous boundary. But Ryan's philosophy contained a fatal flaw, one that he could never acknowledge, because to do so would be to admit that his entire worldview rested on contradiction. He claimed to champion freedom but could not tolerate true competition to his authority. When Frank Fontaine began to amass power through his control of Adam, and his charitable work with the poor, Ryan saw not a fellow entrepreneur, but a threat to order. When religious movements began to emerge in response to the spiritual emptiness some residents felt, Ryan did not see the market of ideas at work but dangerous collectivism that needed to be crushed. The philosopher king could not escape the fundamental problem of all utopian projects. Who guards the guardians? Ryan had built a system with no checks on power beyond individual choice, but when individuals chose to follow someone other than him, when they organized in ways he disapproved of, his response was increasingly authoritarian. He nationalized Fontaine's businesses. He deployed security forces against rivals. He implemented loyalty tests and surveillance. Each step was justified in his mind as protecting freedom from those who would destroy it. He could not see that he had become exactly what he claimed to oppose, a ruler using force to maintain his vision of society against the will of those who lived in it. The man who fled Soviet Russia had recreated its essential structure underwater, only with a different ideology as its foundation. Ryan's tragedy was not that he was wrong about everything. His critique of mindless collectivism had merit. His celebration of human creativity and achievement resonated with genuine truths about what drives progress and innovation. But he made the error that dooms so many visionaries. He confused a useful insight with a complete philosophy, a single principle with a sufficient foundation for an entire society. The absence of gods and kings did not liberate man. It simply created a vacuum that would be filled by new forms of control, some more subtle and more terrible than anything the surface world had devised. And at the centre of it all stood Ryan, increasingly isolated in his office in Hephaestus, convinced that the failure of Rapture was not a failure of his philosophy, but a failure of the people who refused to properly embrace it. This pattern, this inability to accept that the ideological foundation itself might be flawed, would echo in Columbia with Zachary Comstock. Both men built cities in the image of their beliefs. Both refused to acknowledge that human beings are more complex, more contradictory, and more communal than their philosophies allowed. Both would rather see their creations burn than admit that their vision was incomplete. The stage was now set for the introduction of Adam, the genetic material that would amplify every contradiction in Rapture to the point of catastrophic collapse. But before we turn to that chapter, we must understand one more thing about Ryan's vision. It was never really about freedom. It was about the freedom to be exceptional without responsibility to anyone else. And that kind of freedom, as Rapture would demonstrate, is simply another word for chaos wearing a tuxedo. Rapture's physical form was inseparable from its philosophical purpose. The city was not simply built underwater for secrecy or protection. Its location in the crushing depths of the Atlantic served as a constant metaphor for the pressure required to maintain ideological purity. To live in Rapture was to exist in an environment hostile to human life, sustained only by the technology and will of exceptional individuals. Nature itself became an enemy to be conquered, a test of human capability. The architecture reflected this relationship between ideology and environment. Every building in Rapture exhibited Art Deco styling at its most ambitious. Sweeping curves, geometric precision, luxurious materials like marble and brass and crystal. The aesthetic was not chosen for beauty alone, but to make a statement. We are not merely surviving in the deep. We are thriving, creating elegance in a place that should only hold darkness and death. Different districts of Rapture embody different aspects of Ryan's vision. The medical pavilion represented the promise of science unbound by ethics committees. Arcadia demonstrated the ability to create artificial nature through human ingenuity. Fort Frolic was where art could explore any theme without censorship or judgment. Hephaestus, the geothermal core that powered the city, symbolized humanity's ability to harness the planet's raw energy for its own purposes. But even the architecture contained warnings for those who looked closely. The glass tunnels that allowed residents to view the ocean floor also made the danger visible. The pressure was always there, always waiting for a single crack to turn into catastrophic failure. The city's beauty was maintained through constant vigilance and repair. One could interpret this as a testament to human persistence, but perhaps it was also a sign that some dreams are too expensive to maintain, requiring ever more resources just to preserve the status quo. The city's infrastructure revealed further contradictions in Ryan's philosophy. Rapture required massive coordination to function. The air needed to be constantly filtered and replenished. The pressure needed to be constantly balanced. The geothermal systems needed to be constantly monitored. Yet Ryan's ideology celebrated individual action over collective effort. The reality was that an army of workers, many living in poverty in places like Pauper's Drop, maintained the systems that allowed the elite to pursue their individual visions. These workers were invisible in Ryan's speeches about Rapture's greatness. They were the necessary infrastructure like the pipes and the pumps, acknowledged only when they failed. They fixed the leaks, cleaned the corridors, maintained the machines, and in return they received just enough to survive in the most expensive city ever built. The market, Ryan claimed, would sort this out naturally. Those with valuable skills would prosper. Those without would have incentive to develop them. But what happens when the baseline cost of survival is artificially inflated by your location at the bottom of the ocean? When every meal, every breath, every drop of water comes at a premium because it must be imported or manufactured? The market can only function when people have genuine choices. In Rapture, the choice was often between accepting whatever wages were offered or dying. This created a resentment that simmered beneath the city's glittering surface. The poor of Rapture were not lazy or unambitious. Many had been brought to the city with promises of opportunity. They worked grueling jobs maintaining systems they would never fully understand, watching as the fruits of their labor went to scientists and artists who treated them as background scenery. They heard Ryan's speeches about the Great Chain, how each person's value was determined by what they contributed, and they wondered why their contributions seemed to matter so little. Enter Frank Fontaine, a man who understood what Ryan refused to see, that Rapture's underclass represented not a failure of individuals but a market opportunity. While Ryan preached about the virtue of self-reliance, Fontaine offered charity. While Ryan insisted that the poor simply needed to work harder, Fontaine opened soup kitchens and orphanages. He did this not out of altruism, but because he understood that people who feel abandoned by the system are eager to support anyone who offers them kindness. Fontaine's rise demonstrated another flaw in Ryan's philosophy. Ryan believed that in a truly free market, the best products and services would naturally succeed. He assumed that his own vision was so obviously superior that it would triumph over all competition. But Fontaine understood that the market responds not just to quality, but to need, not just to innovation, but to connection. By positioning himself as the people's champion, Fontaine built a power base that Ryan could not match with speeches about rational self-interest. The physical layout of Rapture enabled this division. The wealthy lived in areas like Mercury Suites and Olympus Heights, surrounded by beauty and comfort. The poor clustered in Apollo Square and Pauper's Drop, in cramped quarters with leaking pipes and failing life support. The distance was not just economic but spatial, making it easy for the elite to never encounter the consequences of the system they benefited from. This segregation was not planned in Ryan's original vision. He genuinely believed Rapture would be a meritocracy where anyone with talent could rise. But without mechanisms to ensure opportunity, without systems to prevent the accumulation of inherited advantage, the city quickly stratified. The children of successful residents had access to better education, better nutrition, better opportunities. The children of workers had access to whatever was left. Ryan saw this emerging inequality and interpreted it as proof that some people simply deserved more than others. The alternative, that his system might contain structural flaws that prevented genuine meritocracy, was unthinkable. To acknowledge it would be to acknowledge that collective action and social support might be necessary components of a functional society. It would be to admit that freedom means nothing to someone drowning, and that a rising tide only lifts boats that haven't already sunk. The architecture of Rapture also created isolation. In the surface world, communities form naturally through geographic proximity and shared spaces. But in Rapture, each building was its own sealed environment, connected to others by bathysphere and pneumotube. This design maximized privacy and individual control, but minimized the casual encounters that build social cohesion. You could live in Rapture for years and never speak to your neighbor except through business transactions. This isolation served Ryan's ideology by preventing collective organizing. But it also prevented the kind of community bonds that might have held Rapture together when crisis came. When the Civil War erupted, people retreated into their private domains rather than working together. The architecture that celebrated individual achievement became a maze of fortified positions where neighbour fought neighbour for dwindling resources. Perhaps most tellingly, Rapture was built with no exit strategy. The bathyspheres could carry people to the surface, but Ryan controlled access to them. To leave Rapture was to admit defeat, to acknowledge that you were not strong enough to thrive in paradise. Ryan made sure that leaving carried a social stigma. Those who returned to the surface were weak, parasites who never deserved to be in Rapture in the first place. This transformation of exit into betrayal revealed the authoritarian core beneath Rapture's libertarian surface. True freedom includes the freedom to leave, to say no, to opt out. But Ryan could not tolerate that freedom because it threatened the narrative of Rapture as the pinnacle of human achievement. If people left by choice, it meant Rapture was not perfect, and if Rapture was not perfect, then perhaps Andrew Ryan was not infallible. The city's architecture was also deliberately beautiful in a way that reinforced social control. Every corridor, every plaza, every building reminded residents that they lived in something special, something worth preserving. The Art Deco styling was not just aesthetic but ideological, a constant argument that Rapture represented the height of human civilization. To question the system was to risk losing access to all this beauty, this innovation, this excellence. But beauty maintained through suffering is not beautiful at all. It is a mask, and beneath Rapture's golden mask lay a city built on exploitation, maintained through coercion, and sustained by the refusal to acknowledge that some problems cannot be solved through individual action alone. The architecture of ideology had created a physical space where theory met reality, and reality was slowly crushing the city from all sides. The discovery of Adam changed everything. Not immediately, not obviously, but with the slow certainty of poison spreading through water. What began as a scientific breakthrough, a miracle substance that could rewrite human genetics, became the mechanism through which every flaw in Rapture's philosophy would amplify until the city tore itself apart. Adam was discovered by Dr. Bridget Tenenbaum, a scientist whose own past escaping Nazi concentration camps gave her a particular perspective on what humans were willing to do in the name of progress. She found the substance in a species of sea slug unique to the thermal vents near Rapture. The slugs produced a stem cell compound that could differentiate into any type of human tissue, effectively allowing the body to be reshaped at the genetic level. The implications were staggering. Diseases could be cured with a single injection. Physical abilities could be enhanced beyond natural limits. The human form itself became malleable, limited only by imagination and the amount of Adam you could afford. Here was the ultimate expression of Rapture's promise, the ability to transcend the limitations of biology itself through science and free market innovation. Frank Fontaine immediately recognized the commercial potential. Through his company Fontaine Futuristics, he began marketing plasmids, specialized Adam formulations that granted specific abilities. Want to shoot lightning from your hands? There's a plasmid for that. Want to control minds? There's a plasmid for that. Want to turn invisible, summon swarms of insects, throw fireballs? All available for purchase, no prescription needed, no ethical review required. The plasmid sold beyond Fontaine's wildest projections. This was Rapture's population finally given away to level the playing field, or so they thought. A dock worker who could shoot electricity was suddenly more valuable. An artist who could manipulate matter with telekinesis could create impossible sculptures. The promise was empowerment, the ability to become more than you were. But Adam had a price that went beyond currency. The genetic rewriting caused severe side effects with prolonged use. Physical deformities emerged as the body struggled to maintain coherence through multiple conflicting modifications. Mental deterioration followed as the brain, constantly rewriting itself, lost the ability to maintain stable personality and memory. Users became addicted not just psychologically, but biologically, their cells now dependent on regular Adam to maintain basic functions. The transformation of users into splicers, violent shells of their former selves driven by addiction and madness, should have been a warning. But in Rapture, with no regulatory oversight and no collective concern for public health, the warnings were ignored. Fontaine marketed newer plasmids as solutions to the problems caused by old plasmids. Ryan, meanwhile, refused to intervene because to regulate Adam would be to admit that the market could not self-correct, that some innovations required collective constraints. Tenenbaum's discovery of Adam's true potential came through a horrifying realization. The substance was most potent when harvested from living hosts, specifically young girls who'd been implanted with the sea slugs. These little sisters, as they came to be called, would wander Rapture collecting Adam from the dead, their bodies serving as living factories for the substance that had become Rapture's most valuable commodity. The creation of a Little Sisters represented a moral event horizon. These were children, conditioned through psychological manipulation and genetic modification to serve as Adam harvesters, protected by big daddies, lumbering behemoths in diving suits bonded to their charges through pheromones and conditioning. The program was initially run by Fontaine, but after his supposed death, Ryan took it over, seeing it as necessary for Rapture's survival. This is where the philosophical failure became most apparent. Ryan had built Rapture on the principle that rational, self-interest would create a better society than altruism and collective concern. Yet when the city needed a dam to function, when the economy became dependent on a substance that required the exploitation of children, rational self-interest provided no answer. The market did not care about the Little Sisters, it only cared about the Adam they produced. Individual residents might have moral qualms about the system, but in Rapture there was no mechanism for translating individual morality into collective action. There were no elections to vote out leaders who exploited children. There were no regulations to shut down unethical businesses. There was only the market, and the market had decided that Adam was worth any cost. The Adam economy also created a new kind of inequality, one based not on merit or achievement, but on access to genetic modification. Those who could afford the best plasmids gained abilities that made them even more capable of succeeding, while those who couldn't fell further behind. A combat plasmid made you better at protecting property. A telekinesis plasmid made you better at construction. These advantages compounded, creating a genetic aristocracy. Worse, Adam addiction meant that success became increasingly difficult to maintain without continuous access to the substance. Splicing was not a one-time enhancement but an ongoing need. Users had to keep purchasing Adam to avoid degradation, creating a treadmill where each new advantage required more resources to sustain. The wealthy could maintain their enhancements. The poor spliced until their bodies and minds collapsed. This dynamic destroyed the last pretense of meritocracy and rapture. Success was no longer about talent or hard work, but about who could afford the most genetic modification and maintain it longest. The playing field wasn't level, it was tilted at an angle that kept increasing, and Adam was the mechanism that ensured only those already at the top could stay there. Ryan's response to the Adam crisis revealed how completely his ideology had failed. He could see the destruction it was causing, but interpreted it as a problem of execution rather than a fundamental flaw. If people were abusing Adam, it was because they lacked discipline. If the Little Sister program was brutal, it was a necessary evil in the face of survival. He could not step back and ask whether a system that required such measures to function was worth preserving. The scientific community in Rapture also failed at this juncture. Brilliant minds like Tenenbaum and Dr. Yisu Chong pushed the boundaries of what was possible without asking whether they should. Su Chong's creation of the Big Daddy bonding process involved torturing test subjects until their personalities broke and could be rebuilt. His recordings show him discussing this as a technical challenge, not a moral atrocity. This was the environment Ryan had created, one where scientific inquiry was divorced from ethical consideration. The scientist was not bound by petty morality, remember. In Rapture, the only question that mattered was can it be done, not should it be done. Progress was measured in capability, not in human cost. Tenenbaum would eventually have a crisis of conscience, recognizing the Little Sisters as victims rather than resources. But she was the exception. Most of Rapture's scientific elite continued their work, driven by curiosity and competition, blind to or uncaring about the human suffering they created. They were not mad scientists in the traditional sense. They were simply scientists working in a system that removed all constraints on their worst impulses. The plasmids themselves became a record of Rapture's descent. Early ones had elegant names and were marketed as tools for achievement. Electrobolt to power machinery, telekinesis to aid in construction, incinerate to facilitate industry. Later plasmids had names that revealed their purpose more honestly. Enrage to turn your enemies against each other, insect swarm to weaponize biology, security bullseye to weaponize the city's defense systems. The evolution from tools to weapons tracked Rapture's transformation from city to battleground. The war between Andrew Ryan and Atlas was not simply a power struggle between two men. It was the inevitable conclusion of building a society on principles that could not account for human nature's messy reality. When Frank Fontaine faked his death and re-emerged as Atlas, a working-class Irish revolutionary, he did so because he understood what Ryan never could. People need more than freedom to succeed. They need community, purpose, and the belief that the system they live in offers them genuine opportunity for a better life. Atlas positioned himself as everything Ryan was not. Where Ryan spoke in grand philosophical abstractions, Atlas spoke in simple, relatable terms about family and survival. Where Ryan demanded that the poor bootstrap themselves out of poverty, Atlas acknowledged that the deck was stacked against them. Where Ryan isolated himself in his tower, Atlas presented himself as a man of the people, fighting alongside them in the streets. The genius of Atlas's deception was that it wasn't entirely a deception. The grievances he voiced were real. The inequality he pointed to existed. The suffering he described was happening all around. Frank Fontaine might have been cynically manipulating the population for his own gain, but the manipulation only worked because it spoke to genuine truths about life in Rapture. Ryan's response to Atlas's rebellion revealed how far he had drifted from his own stated principles. He nationalized Fontaine Futuristics, seizing it from its rightful owners. He deployed his security forces to crush dissent, turning Rapture's police into his personal army. He implemented pheromone control through the city's air system, attempting to literally chemically control the population's behavior. Each action contradicted the free market libertarianism he claimed to champion, but in Ryan's mind, these measures were not contradictions. They are necessary to protect freedom from those who would destroy it. Atlas and his followers represented collectivism, communism, everything Ryan had fled Russia to escape. They had to be stopped, even if stopping them required using the very tools of authoritarian control Ryan supposedly opposed. The cognitive dissonance was total, but Ryan could not see it. The Civil War turned Rapture into a nightmare. Neighborhoods became battle zones. Spleers mad from Adam addiction fought for both sides or simply fought for their next fix. The big daddies, programmed to protect little sisters, killed anyone who threatened their charges, turning the city's corridors into death traps. The infrastructure began to fail as maintenance workers died or fled, and water began seeping through cracks that no one was left to repair. What's striking about the war is how it destroyed the very things both sides claimed to be fighting for. Ryan wanted to preserve Rapture as a monument to individual achievement, but his methods turned it into a totalitarian state. Atlas claimed to fight for the people's welfare, but his tactics created chaos that made everyone's life worse. Both men were willing to burn the city to win their ideological argument. The player's arrival in Rapture comes at the tail end of this conflict, when the city is already a tomb. The 1960 setting is crucial because it represents a moment frozen in time. Rapture's golden age ended years ago. What remains is a haunted shell, populated by the victims of its philosophical failure. Every splicer you encounter was once a person with dreams and ambitions who came to Rapture seeking freedom. Adam and ideology reduced them to monsters. The Civil War also demonstrated how Rapture's lack of collective institutions made conflict resolution impossible. In a democracy, no matter how flawed, there are mechanisms for peaceful transition of power, for addressing grievances, for negotiating between competing interests. But Rapture had none of these. It had only the market and force. When the market failed to satisfy one faction, force was the only option. This is not to say that democracy is perfect or that collective action solves all problems, but the complete absence of any mechanism beyond individual confrontation ensured that every disagreement had the potential to escalate to violence. Ryan could not compromise with Atlas because his entire philosophy was built on the idea that compromise with collectivism was surrender. Atlas could not work within the system because the system was designed to prevent the kind of collective organizing he represented. The war also revealed how Adam had compromised everyone's judgment. Ryan's increasing paranoia and erratic decision-making showed signs of splice damage. Many of Atlas's followers were splicers whose addiction made them easy to manipulate. Even the player character, as we will discover, is controlled through Adam-based conditioning. The substance that was supposed to perfect humanity instead corrupted everyone it touched. The recordings scattered throughout Rapture tell the story of this collapse in personal terms. We hear from Dr. Steinman, a plastic surgeon who spliced until he believed he could create beauty through mutilation. We hear from Sander Cohen, an artist whose genius curdled into sadistic performance art. We hear from Ryan himself, becoming increasingly isolated and desperate as his city crumbles. Each recording is a tombstone for someone who came to Rapture seeking freedom and found only the freedom to destroy themselves. The phrase, "would you kindly," becomes the key that unlocks BioShock's central revelation and its meta-narrative about video games and player agency. Throughout the game, Atlas guides the player with suggestions that begin with this phrase. Would you kindly head to Ryan's office? Would you kindly find the override key? The player follows these instructions because they seem like helpful guidance, quest objectives in the language of games. The revelation that these phrases are trigger commands, that the player character Jack is a sleeper agent programmed to obey anyone who uses them, recontextualizes everything. Every action we took was not free choice but conditioned obedience. We were not the hero arriving to save Rapture. We were a weapon, a tool created by Frank Fontaine to accomplish what Atlas could not: infiltrate Ryan's inner sanctum and assassinate him. This twist works on multiple levels simultaneously. Within the narrative, it explains Jack's unusual abilities and convenient arrival at Rapture just when Atlas needed him. Jack is Ryan's illegitimate son, sold to Fontaine as an infant, aged rapidly through genetic modification, and conditioned to respond to the trigger phrase. He is the perfect infiltrator because Ryan's genetic locks recognize him as family, while his mind belongs to Fontaine. But the deeper meaning operates on the meta level, interrogating the nature of player agency in video games. We play games and follow quest markers, accepting objectives without question, because that's how games work. The game tells us to go somewhere or kill someone, and we do it. We might choose how to accomplish the goal, but we rarely question whether we should be attempting it in the first place. BioShock asks, is that really freedom? When you follow the golden path laid out by the game's designers, when you complete objectives because they appear in your quest log, are you making choices or simply following programming? The "would you kindly" conditioning becomes a metaphor for the invisible rails that guide player behavior in every game. The confrontation with Andrew Ryan drives this point home with brutal clarity. Ryan has discovered Jack's true nature and the conditioning that controls him. Rather than fight or flee, he decides to make a final statement about power and freedom. He hands the player character a golf club and utters the commands, "A man chooses, a slave obeys. Would you kindly kill Andrew Ryan?" The player has no choice in what follows. Despite everything, despite knowing we're being controlled, the game forces us to watch as Jack beats Ryan to death with the golf club. We can look away from the screen, but we cannot stop the action. The game's mechanics, the very structure of player input, compel us to participate in Ryan's murder. Ryan's last words reframe his entire arc. He chose death on his own terms rather than allow Fontaine to use him as a tool. In his final moments, he understood that he was not the slave, and we were. His philosophy had failed to create a free society, but at least he could demonstrate what he meant by freedom in choosing how he died. It is a Pyrrhic victory, a philosophical point made in blood, but it forces the player to confront uncomfortable questions about agency and autonomy. The revelation also recontextualizes Rapture's entire philosophy. Ryan built a city based on the idea that humans are rational actors, making free choices in their own self-interest. But Jack represents the opposite, a human mind completely subverted, making choices that serve someone else's interest while believing they are free. If conditioning can override free will so completely, what does that say about the foundation of Ryan's philosophy? Moreover, the conditioning was accomplished through Adam, the same substance that was supposed to perfect humanity. The very tool of enhancement became the mechanism of control. This mirrors how Rapture's promise of freedom became a cage, how its celebration of individual achievement created new forms of bondage, how its rejection of collective responsibility led to exploitation. After Ryan's death, Atlas reveals himself as Fontaine, discarding the working-class accent and revolutionary rhetoric. He was never fighting for the people. He was building his own power base, using their genuine grievances as leverage. The revolution was a con, and everyone who fought for Atlas was as controlled as Jack, just through different means. Economics and ideology rather than direct mental conditioning, but control nonetheless. Fontaine's takeover of the Little Sister program becomes his final play. With Ryan dead and the Civil War won, he attempts to harvest all the Adam from every Little Sister in Rapture, transforming himself into a godlike being. He has no interest in ruling Rapture or reforming it. He simply wants power, the ultimate expression of Ryan's philosophy stripped of all pretense. Fontaine is what you get when rational self-interest has no constraints. The player's choice regarding the Little Sisters offers a genuine moment of agency within the otherwise constrained narrative. You can harvest them for maximum Adam, killing them in the process, or you can save them, freeing them from their conditioning at the cost of resources. The game uses this choice to determine which ending the player receives, but more importantly, it gives the player a decision that actually matters in a game that has spent hours demonstrating how little control we truly have. This choice is meaningful precisely because it's moral rather than strategic. Saving the Little Sisters makes the game harder. You get less Adam and must be more careful with your plasmid use. But the game rewards this sacrifice with a better ending, one where the Little Sisters escape Rapture and grow up to live full lives. It suggests that perhaps genuine freedom comes not from maximizing personal advantage, but from choosing to help others even when it costs you. The "would you?" kindly revelation remains one of gaming's most effective narrative twists because it doesn't just subvert player expectations, it makes the player complicit in the story's themes. We participated in Ryan's murder because the game made us, yes, but also because we thoughtlessly followed instructions without questioning them. BioShock holds up a mirror and shows us that we're often willing slaves to game design, accepting our lack of agency as long as the illusion is maintained. Where Rapture sank beneath the waves to escape the world's corrupting influence, Columbia rose above the clouds with the opposite intention, to spread American values across the globe through divine mandate. Built in 1893 and launched in 1901, this floating city represented American exceptionalism, transformed from political philosophy into literal architecture, a manifestation of the belief that America was chosen by God to lead humanity into enlightenment. Zachary Comstock, calling himself the prophet, founded Columbia on principles that inverted Ryan's atheistic individualism. Where Ryan declared, "No gods, no kings, only man," Comstock proclaimed divine authority channeled through American nationalism. Where Rapture rejected religion as weakness, Columbia made it foundational. Yet despite these surface differences, both cities shared a fatal flaw: the conviction that their particular vision of perfection justified any atrocity committed in its name. Comstock's background reveals the twisted path that led to Columbia's creation. He fought at Wounded Knee, participating in the massacre of Lakota Sioux that marked one of the darkest moments in American history. The guilt from this action led him to a baptism, a moment of supposed rebirth where he believed his sins were washed away. But this forgiveness did not lead to repentance or change. Instead, it convinced him that divine grace had marked him for a special purpose. The prophet's theology mixed Protestant Christianity with American civil religion and racial pseudoscience into something uniquely toxic. He positioned the Founding Fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin, as divine figures whose portraits appeared in Columbia's churches alongside religious iconography. The city's calendar marked American historical events as holy days. The Constitution was treated as scripture, interpreted through Comstock's lens to justify his vision of social order. Central to this theology was the concept of American exceptionalism, taken to its most extreme conclusion. Comstock taught that America was not merely a nation blessed by God, but the fulfillment of divine will on earth. White Americans, particularly those who followed Comstock's teachings, were God's chosen people, destined to bring order and enlightenment to the lesser races. This was not subtle subtext, but explicit doctrine, taught in Columbia's schools and preached from its pulpits. The city's floating nature served multiple symbolic purposes. Literally rising above the earth positioned Columbia as closer to heaven, a New Jerusalem suspended between the profane world below and the divine realm above. The height also represented superiority, looking down upon the nations that had not achieved America's greatness. And practically it allowed Columbia to travel, spreading American influence without being bound to any particular territory. Columbia's architecture reflected this theological nationalism. Buildings combined neoclassical American styles with religious Gothic elements, creating structures that were simultaneously governmental and sacred. Monuments to American military victories shared space with churches. Statues of Comstock in prophet's robes stood alongside memorials to Revolutionary War heroes. Every element of the city's design reinforced the message that American power and divine will were synonymous. But beneath the patriotic bunting and religious imagery, Columbia was built on the same foundation of exploitation as Rapture. The city's white citizens enjoyed prosperity and comfort, but this lifestyle was maintained through the labor of the Vox Populi, an underclass of minorities and immigrants who did the work that kept the floating city aloft. They repaired the quantum levitation devices, cleaned the streets, built the buildings, and were rewarded with poverty, segregation, and violent suppression of any dissent. The racism in Columbia was not a flaw in the system but its core feature. Comstock's ideology required racial hierarchy to function. If white Americans were God's chosen people, then other races had to be inferior by divine design. This wasn't simply prejudice but cosmic truth in the prophet's theology. The oppression was therefore not merely justified but holy, an enforcement of natural and spiritual order. The city celebrated this hierarchy through monuments and public displays that would make a modern viewer recoil. Raffle events where the winner got to throw a baseball at an interracial couple. Museums depicting non-white peoples as evolutionary throwbacks. Propaganda posters showing Columbia's benevolent white citizens civilizing grateful primitive peoples. What makes this particularly disturbing is that much of it was drawn directly from actual American history and propaganda from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Columbia represents BioShock Infinite's courage in holding up a mirror to American mythology. While Rapture critiqued a relatively niche philosophy in Objectivism, Columbia takes aim at ideas woven deeply into American identity. The exceptionalism, the manifest destiny, the civil religion that treats national history as sacred narrative, all are present in Columbia in exaggerated but recognizable form. The floating city's apparent utopian surface hid the same contradictions that doomed Rapture. Comstock preached about divine order and traditional values, but his own power came from advanced quantum physics developed by Lutece. He condemned the modern world's obsession with progress and science, yet his city could only exist through cutting-edge technology. He positioned himself as a religious prophet, but his visions of the future came from the Lutece's ability to observe alternate timelines. This tension between Columbia's traditional religious surface and its science fiction reality reflected real tensions in American thought. The city wanted to be both a return to imagined past purity and a leap into a glorious future. It wanted to be both chosen by God and superior through achievement. These contradictions never resolved because Comstock's theology didn't require coherence, only faith and obedience. The Vox Populi uprising led by Daisy Fitzroy provided the conflict that drives BioShock Infinite's plot, but it also revealed Columbia's philosophical failure. Where Atlas's rebellion in Rapture exploited genuine grievances to serve Fontaine's ambitions, Fitzroy's revolution was initially a genuine attempt to overthrow an oppressive system. The Vox wanted not to rule Columbia, but to dismantle the racial and economic hierarchy that defined it. Yet as the rebellion progressed, it became increasingly violent and indiscriminate. Fitzroy's forces killed not just Comstock soldiers but civilians, destroyed not just government buildings but homes and businesses. The revolution consumed itself, proving unable to distinguish between necessary resistance and simple revenge. This dissent troubled many players, as it seemed to suggest a false equivalence between oppressor and oppressed. But the game's treatment of the Vox reveals something more subtle about revolutionary violence and moral complexity. The Vox did not become monsters because rebellion is inherently corrupting. They became violent because they were fighting a system that had violently oppressed them for decades. Their methods grew extreme because moderate resistance had accomplished nothing. The equivalence was not moral but practical. Violence begets violence, and systems built on oppression create conditions where peaceful change becomes impossible. Columbia's technological marvels, the skylines that allowed rapid transportation through the air, the Songbird Guardian that enforced Comstock's will, the floating platforms that defied gravity, all were made possible by the Lutece Twins' research into quantum mechanics and alternate realities. This was perhaps the city's greatest irony. Its existence depended on science that contradicted everything Comstock claimed to believe about divine creation and natural order. The prophet's relationship with the Luteces exemplified his hypocrisy. He used their discoveries while suppressing their true nature. Rosalind Lutece was a brilliant physicist whose work in quantum levitation made Columbia possible. Robert Lutece was her alternate universe counterpart, brought into this reality through her experiments. Their gender nonconformity, scientific rationalism, and eventually their moral qualms about Comstock's plans made them dangerous to his narrative. When the Luteces attempted to stop Comstock from kidnapping Anna DeWitt, the infant daughter of Booker DeWitt who would become Elizabeth, Comstock had them killed. Or rather, he tried to. The nature of their quantum existence meant their death scattered them across dimensions, transforming them into unstuck observers who could move between realities while remaining unable to directly change events. Their murder attempt backfired, creating the very instruments that would eventually bring about Comstock's downfall. Elizabeth herself represented everything Comstock claimed to value, while simultaneously being the instrument of his destruction. Raised in isolation in Monument Tower, conditioned to see Comstock as her father and herself as Columbia's future leader, she embodied innocence and purity. But her power to open tears into alternate realities, a result of losing part of her finger in the dimensional door during her kidnapping, made her the most powerful being in any universe. Comstock's plan to use Elizabeth as a weapon to rain fire on the Sodom below, to punish the sinful surface world and establish Columbia as the dominant power, revealed the ultimate endpoint of his philosophy. American exceptionalism combined with religious certainty and unlimited power led not to enlightenment but to apocalypse. The future visions showed Columbia bombing New York, Elizabeth transformed from innocent girl into avenging angel, bringing judgment upon the world that rejected her father's message. This trajectory from righteous city to genocidal theocracy was not an aberration, but the logical conclusion of Columbia's founding principles. When you believe your nation is chosen by God, when you believe your race is naturally superior, when you believe your enemies are not merely wrong but spiritually corrupted, then any violence against them becomes holy work. The massacre is not a tragedy, but a sacrament. The game forces players to confront this through Booker DeWitt's journey. Initially, Booker appears to be an outside observer, a cynical private detective hired to extract Elizabeth from Columbia. But as the story unfolds, we learn that Booker is Comstock. Or rather, in this timeline, Booker rejected the baptism that in another timeline created Zachary Comstock. The two men are quantum variants, the same person who made different choices at a crucial moment. This revelation recontextualizes everything about Columbia's founding and Booker's mission. Comstock's sterility and rapid aging, side effects of the Lutece's technology, made him unable to produce an heir naturally. So he reached across dimensions to steal the daughter of his alternate self, the man he might have been if he'd rejected the baptism and carried his guilt rather than washing it away in false absolution. The theft of Anna DeWitt and her transformation into Elizabeth created the paradox that drives the entire game. Booker, driven mad by grief and memory loss caused by the dimensional crossing, was given false memories by the Luteces to motivate him to retrieve his daughter. The debt he believes he must pay to wipe away his past is literally himself trying to undo what his alternate self did. Every attempt to rescue Elizabeth is also an attempt to undo Comstock's existence. Columbia's destruction in the game's conclusion comes not from external force but from internal contradiction made manifest. The city that preached order and traditional values was built on quantum uncertainty. The prophet who claimed divine authority was a version of the man sent to kill him. The pure, innocent daughter was the stolen child of his greatest enemy, who was also himself. The stable, eternal kingdom was always collapsing under the weight of its own impossibilities. The difference between Columbia and Rapture's falls is instructive. Rapture collapsed because its philosophy could not account for human needs beyond individual achievement. It imploded from economic inequality and social breakdown. Columbia, however, was built on a paradox from the beginning. It required both the superiority of faith and the power of science, both traditional values and revolutionary technology, both Comstock's existence and his impossibility. It could never have lasted because it was never coherent. Rosalind and Robert Lutece exist outside normal causality, observing the story from a perspective that transcends individual timelines. Their role in BioShock Infinite transforms the narrative from a story about one city's fall to an exploration of choice, determinism, and the nature of reality itself. Through them, the game introduces concepts of quantum mechanics and parallel universes that complicate everything we thought we understood about both Columbia and Rapture. The Luteces operate on the principle that there are constants and variables. Constants are events and elements that occur in every timeline, unchangeable fundamental aspects of reality. Variables are the details that differ, the choices that branch into alternate possibilities. This framework allows the game to tell a story about free will while acknowledging that some patterns repeat regardless of individual decisions. Their experiments with quantum levitation began as pure science, an attempt to overcome gravity and enable flight. But as Rosalind's work progressed, she discovered that manipulating quantum particles could do more than make objects float. It could bridge between parallel universes, between the infinite variations of reality that quantum theory suggests must exist. This discovery attracted Comstock's attention and his funding. Comstock saw in the Luteces' work an opportunity to solidify his divine authority. If he could access visions of the future, he could present them as prophecies, proof that God spoke through him. The Luteces, focused on scientific achievement and eager for resources to continue their research, didn't initially question what their work would be used for. This moral blindness mirrors the scientists of Rapture, brilliant minds pursuing knowledge without considering consequences. Robert Lutece's arrival from an alternate dimension changed this dynamic. He was Rosalind's male counterpart from a world where gender roles in science had developed differently. Meeting himself across dimensional boundaries gave both Lutece's perspective on the implications of their work. They could see not just one timeline but multiple possibilities, including futures where Comstock used Elizabeth as a weapon of mass destruction. Their attempt to prevent this future by sabotaging the machine during Anna's kidnapping led to their death, a scattering across quantum possibilities that left them able to observe but not directly intervene. They became something like ghosts, present in multiple timelines simultaneously, aware of the patterns that repeated across realities but unable to force change. All they could do was arrange circumstances, nudge probabilities, and hope that somewhere, in some iteration, things would turn out differently. This state of existence gave the Lutece a unique perspective on the game's central question. Do our choices matter if every possible choice is made in some universe? If there's a reality where you save the little sisters, and one where you harvest them, where you kill Comstock and where you become him, then what weight does any individual decision carry? The Lutece's answer, implied through their actions, is that choices matter precisely because they create new realities. Each decision branches into new possibilities, new universes where different outcomes manifest. The fact that somewhere you made the opposite choice doesn't diminish the significance of the choice you did make in this timeline. You're not responsible for your alternate selves, only for yourself. This philosophy contrasts sharply with both Ryan's deterministic view that rational self-interest inevitably leads to optimal outcomes, and Comstock's belief in predestination and divine will. The Luteces suggest that reality is neither predetermined nor perfectly malleable, but rather a vast tree of branching possibilities where choices matter, but also multiply infinitely. Their experiments with Elizabeth revealed the extent of her power and its source. The accident that severed her pinky finger left part of her existing in one dimension, while the rest existed in another. This quantum superposition gave her the ability to create tears, to reach across the boundaries between universes and pull things through. She could access alternate timelines, bring objects or people from other realities, and eventually learn to navigate the multiverse consciously. Elizabeth's power represented both hope and danger. In the right hands, with proper understanding, it could be used to access infinite resources, infinite knowledge, infinite possibilities. But Comstock's plan to weaponize her ability would have led to destruction across multiple timelines. A single world's genocidal war becomes a multiversal catastrophe when the weapon can strike across dimensions. The Lutece's role as guides to Booker throughout the game takes on new meaning with each revelation. Every cryptic comment, every seemingly random encounter, every coin flip that always lands the same way despite quantum possibility, all point to their attempts to navigate probability space toward an outcome where Comstock's timeline can be prevented from existing at all. Their coin flip sequence at the game's beginning exemplifies this. They flip the coin 122 times across different timelines, and it's come up heads every time. This impossibility serves multiple purposes. It hints at the looping nature of the narrative. It suggests that some things remain constant across variables, and it implies that the Luteces are operating with knowledge of outcomes before they occur. But the most profound aspect of the Luteces' quantum existence is what it suggests about consciousness and identity. If there are infinite versions of you making different choices, which one is really you? Are you the sum of all possibilities, or are you defined by the specific choices made in this particular timeline? The Luteces, existing across multiple realities simultaneously, have had to grapple with this question directly. Their answer seems to be that identity is both singular and plural. Robert and Rosalind are different people but also the same person, separated by quantum variation yet united by fundamental similarity. They maintain distinct personalities and perspectives while recognizing their essential unity. This paradox mirrors the relationship between Booker and Comstock, the same man who diverged into opposing identities based on a single choice. The quantum mechanics in BioShock Infinite are not perfectly scientifically accurate, nor do they need to be. They serve as a framework for exploring philosophical questions about determinism and free will, about whether our choices define us or reveal us, about whether the self is a fixed point or a branching tree of possibilities. The Luteces also introduce the concept of quantum entanglement on a narrative level. Events in Columbia are entangled with events in Rapture, not causally but thematically. The cities exist in different times and places, founded on opposite philosophies, yet they follow similar trajectories toward destruction. This suggests that certain patterns, certain human tendencies, repeat across all possible configurations. This is the tragedy the Luteces recognize, that no matter how many times reality branches, certain outcomes seem inevitable. Cities built on ideological purity fail. Power concentrated in the hands of believers in their own righteousness corrupts. The attempt to create perfection through force or control leads to catastrophe. These are constants, and the variables of when, where, and how they manifest do not change the fundamental pattern. Yet the Luteces don't succumb to nihilism. If anything, their understanding of quantum reality makes them more invested in intervention. They know that while patterns repeat, variations exist. They know that small changes can cascade into different outcomes. They know that somewhere, in some timeline, things might turn out better. And that possibility, however small, makes the effort worthwhile. Their final gift to Booker and Elizabeth is the knowledge needed to break the cycle, to prevent Comstock from ever existing by drowning Booker at the moment of baptism before the split occurs. This solution is paradoxical and costs Booker his existence across all timelines where he becomes Comstock, but it's also the only way to prevent the futures where Elizabeth becomes a weapon of apocalypse. The Luteces represent a rare example of scientists in the BioShock universe who learn from their mistakes, who recognize that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, and who accept responsibility for the consequences of their discoveries. They cannot undo their role in creating Columbia or empowering Comstock, but they can work across infinite timelines to ensure that somewhere the damage is limited. Their existence also raises questions about consciousness and continuity. When the Lutzes observe multiple timelines simultaneously, do they experience them sequentially or all at once? Are they one consciousness spread across infinity, or infinite consciousnesses in communication? The game wisely doesn't answer these questions, leaving them as mysteries that enhance rather than diminish the narrative. What the Lutzes ultimately represent is the idea that understanding reality's fundamental nature doesn't make choices meaningless. If anything, it makes them more important. When you can see how one decision ripples across infinite possibilities, when you understand that every choice creates new universes, the weight of responsibility doesn't decrease. It multiplies, and yet they keep trying, keep nudging probabilities, keep hoping that somewhere, somehow, the pattern can break. Elizabeth DeWitt begins the game as a prisoner in a tower, kept isolated from Columbia by Comstock and guarded by the mechanical monstrosity called Songbird. But her imprisonment is more complex than physical containment. She's been conditioned to see her cage as protection, to view Comstock as a loving father rather than her kidnapper, and to accept her isolation as necessary preparation for her future role as Columbia's divine heir. When Booker arrives to rescue her, Elizabeth's initial reaction is joy at escape mixed with confusion about the outside world. She has spent her entire life in Monument Tower, her only companions being books, her only window the tears she can create into, alternate realities. She's simultaneously innocent and impossibly wise, sheltered from Columbia's cruelty yet able to glimpse infinite variations of reality through her powers. The tower itself is significant symbolically. It evokes fairy tales of princesses trapped in towers waiting for rescue, but Elizabeth is no passive maiden. Her power makes her the most dangerous being in Columbia, perhaps in any reality. The tower doesn't just keep her in, it keeps her power contained, prevents her from realizing her full potential, and shields her from the truth about her nature and origins. As Elizabeth travels through Columbia with Booker, her understanding of the world expands rapidly. She sees the beauty of the city's architecture and art, but also witnesses its racism, violence, and oppression. She observes how the citizens treat the Vox Populi, how casually cruelty is inflicted on those deemed inferior. Her idealized vision of Columbia, carefully constructed by her isolated upbringing, crumbles piece by piece. This awakening is painful but necessary. Elizabeth must shed her innocence, not because innocence itself is bad, but because her particular innocence was constructed through lies and manipulation. To become herself, to own her power and her choices, she must first recognize the truth about the world and her place in it. The journey from tower to truth is the journey from childhood to agency. Her relationship with Booker drives much of this development. Initially, she sees him as a rescuer, rough around the edges but fundamentally good. As they travel, together she begins to recognize his flaws, his violence, his guilt over past actions. The revelation that he sold his infant daughter to pay a gambling debt would shatter her image of him if she knew the full context. But she doesn't, not yet, because the truth is more complex and more terrible than simple betrayal. Elizabeth's power to open tears represents unlimited potential, constrained by understanding. At first, she can only open small tears, bringing through objects or briefly glimpsing other worlds. She doesn't control this ability so much as react to it, pulling through things that she needs or desires without fully understanding the mechanism. It's power without mastery, potential without direction. The progression of her abilities tracks with her emotional and intellectual growth. As she learns more about herself, Columbia, and the nature of reality, her power expands. She begins to open larger tiers, to maintain them longer, to use them strategically rather than reactively. By the game's end, she can navigate the multiverse consciously, seeing and accessing infinite realities simultaneously. This growth mirrors the player's own expanding understanding of the game's narrative. Just as Elizabeth learns to see through surfaces to deeper truths, players gradually discover the connections between Booker and Comstock, between Columbia and Rapture, between individual choice and predetermined pattern. The game's structure makes Elizabeth's journey of awakening parallel our own. Her theft from Booker by Comstock created the wound that gives her power. The pinky finger left behind in the other dimension, as the portal closed, left her existing partially in two realities simultaneously. This quantum superposition transformed her into a being who could bridge worlds, who could violate the normal boundaries of space and time. Her greatest ability came from her greatest trauma. This raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between suffering and power, between wound and gift. Elizabeth's ability makes her special, yes, but it also marks her as broken, split between realities just as she was split from her father. Her power is not compensation for trauma, but a different form of it, a constant reminder that she doesn't fully exist in any single world. The Songbird, the biomechanical creature that serves as a jailer and guardian, represents another aspect of her cage. Imprinted on her from childhood, conditioned to protect her while preventing her escape, Songbird embodies obsessive love transformed into control. Comstock created it to ensure Elizabeth could never leave, binding it to her through mechanisms that made separation painful for both. When Elizabeth finally gains control over Songbird, using a controlling device and her understanding of its conditioning, she doesn't destroy it immediately. She recognizes it as another victim of Comstock's manipulation, another being trapped by someone else's vision of what it should be. In the end, she uses it to attack Columbia's forces before drowning it in the ocean near Rapture, a mercy killing that frees them both. The revelation of Elizabeth's true identity as Anna DeWitt recontextualizes everything about her character. She's not Comstock's daughter, but Booker's, stolen in infancy and raised in a lie. Every memory of her childhood with a prophet is false or distorted. Her entire sense of self was constructed by her kidnapper to serve his purposes. Learning this truth should destroy her, but instead it liberates her to choose who she wants to be. This speaks to the game's central theme of constants and variables. Elizabeth's fundamental nature, her curiosity, kindness, and strength, remained constant despite Comstock's attempts to shape her. But the variables, her beliefs about her family, her purpose, her place in the world, could change once she knew the truth. She was not determined by her upbringing, but neither was she entirely free from it. She had to integrate both truth and lies into a new understanding of herself. The sequence where Elizabeth accesses her full power and sees all realities simultaneously is both triumphant and tragic. She becomes nearly omniscient, understanding the connections between Booker and Comstock, between Columbia and Rapture, between all the timelines and choices that led to this moment. But with that knowledge comes the burden of knowing what must be done to prevent Comstock's atrocities across infinite realities. She brings Booker to the baptism, to the moment where he either accepts forgiveness for Wounded Knee and becomes Comstock, or rejects it and remains Booker DeWitt. She shows him that this single choice branched into infinite tragedies, that every timeline where he became Comstock led to Columbia, to her kidnapping, to apocalypse, and she asks him to accept the only solution, drowning at the moment of choice, preventing the split from occurring. This sacrifice is paradoxical and profound. Booker must die before becoming either version of himself to prevent Comstock from ever existing. Elizabeth and all the other Elizabeths from across the multiverse gather to drown him in baptismal waters, ensuring that in no timeline does Zachary Comstock emerge from those waters to build Columbia. It's murder and mercy, ending and prevention, all at once. The ending suggests that this drowning collapses the realities where Comstock existed, while preserving those where Booker rejected baptism and lived on as himself. The post-credits scene showing Booker waking in his apartment with Anna's cries from the other room implies that there exists at least one timeline where he never sold his daughter, where his guilt did not consume him, where his choices led to different outcomes. But Elizabeth's sacrifice goes further. By ensuring Comstock never existed, she erases her own existence as Elizabeth. She cannot be born because the man who would kidnap her as Anna never becomes that man. The Tower, Columbia, her entire life, all of it vanishes into quantum impossibility. She chooses this knowing full well what it means. She chooses her own obliteration to prevent infinite suffering. This is perhaps the most powerful expression of genuine freedom in the entire BioShock series. Not Ryan's freedom to pursue self-interest without constraint, not Comstock's freedom to enforce divine will on others, but the freedom to sacrifice yourself to prevent harm to others. Elizabeth becomes truly free only at the moment she chooses to cease existing. Her character arc represents a journey from caged innocence through painful awakening to selfless choice. She begins as someone who doesn't know she's imprisoned, learns the truth about her cage and her power, and finally uses that power to free not herself but countless others from the consequences of Comstock's ambitions. It's a hero's journey that ends not in triumph, but in erasure, in the quiet acceptance that some problems can only be solved by removing yourself from the equation. The tragedy is that Elizabeth's choice is only necessary because of the actions of men who claim to act for the greater good. Comstock kidnapped her because he believed Columbia needed an heir to fulfill its divine mandate. Booker sold her because he believed he had no other way to pay his debts. The Lutece enabled all of it because they believed their scientific discoveries would lead to progress. Every man in her story made choices that they justified, and she paid the price. Yet Elizabeth never becomes a victim in the traditional sense. She is victimized, yes, but she refuses to let that victimization define her. She takes the trauma of her existence and transforms it into agency, uses the power born from being split between worlds to navigate those worlds consciously, and ultimately makes the one choice that her nature as a multiversal being allows: to be and not be simultaneously, to exist in the moment of deciding not to exist. The Burial at Sea DLC connects Rapture and Columbia explicitly, revealing that Elizabeth's story did not end with Comstock's erasure. In this alternate reality, a version of Comstock survived by fleeing to Rapture, trying to escape his guilt and his memories by becoming a different person in a different city. But you cannot outrun yourself across dimensions. The past has a way of finding you. This Comstock, calling himself Booker DeWitt, has suppressed his memories through Adam and built a new life as a private detective in Rapture's golden age before the fall. But the existence of Sally, a little sister who is actually the Anna/Elizabeth he lost when the portal closed on her head during the kidnapping, pulls him back into his old patterns. Even in Rapture, even wearing a different name, he cannot escape the consequences of his choices. Elizabeth arrives in this timeline hunting the last Comstock, determined to ensure that every version of him across all realities faces justice for what he did to her. She poses as a femme fatale hiring him to find Sally, knowing that the search will force him to confront who he really is. The revelation breaks through his Adam-induced amnesia, and the memories flood back along with the guilt he tried to wash away in baptism and drown in genetic modification. The first episode of Burial at Sea ends with Comstock's death, killed accidentally when Elizabeth forces him to confront what he did. But her revenge comes at a cost. Sally is trapped in Rapture because of Elizabeth's actions, and a version of Elizabeth who exists partially in this timeline feels responsible. The second episode shifts perspective to Elizabeth herself, now powerless after Comstock's death severed her connection to the quantum mechanics that gave her abilities. This powerless Elizabeth must navigate Rapture before its fall, dealing with characters we met in the first BioShock, Suchong, Cohen, Fontaine, and piecing together events that would later lead to Jack's arrival and Ryan's downfall. The DLC reveals that Elizabeth's actions in Rapture, her attempts to save Sally and make amends for her revenge, become the very mechanisms that enable the original BioShock to occur. She helps Suchong develop the "would you kindly" conditioning that Fontaine will later use on Jack. She does this not to enable control, but because it's the only way to save Sally, and the other little sisters in this timeline. The moral complexity is crushing. To save children in this moment, she must create the tool that will enable their exploitation. To prevent greater harm, she must participate in creating lesser harm. The DLC also reveals connections between Columbia's technology and Rapture's. The Lutece particle, Rosalind's discovery that enabled Columbia to float, has applications in Rapture's plasmid development. Suchong's work with quantum mechanics mirrors some of the Lutece's research. The cities, built on opposite philosophical foundations in different decades, share technological DNA that suggests parallel development of similar ideas. This connection implies something profound about human innovation and its consequences. Whether you build your city in the sky on religious nationalism or in the ocean on atheistic individualism, the technology you develop leads to similar outcomes. The tools of enhancement become tools of control. The promise of transcendence leads to new forms of bondage. The pattern repeats because the pattern is embedded in human nature, not in the particular ideology used to justify it. Elizabeth's final sacrifice in Burial at Sea completes her arc across the entire series. She allows herself to be killed by Atlas/Fontaine after giving him the ace in the hole, the phrase, "would you kindly," that will control Jack. Her death is not meaningless but purposeful. She has seen across all timelines and knows that this must happen for events to unfold in a way that gives the little sisters a chance at freedom through Jack's eventual choice to save rather than harvest them. In her final moments, she experiences a vision of the futures where Jack saves the little sisters, where they escape Rapture and grow up to live normal lives, one of them even sitting with an elderly man on his deathbed. The implication is that this man is a version of Booker from a timeline where he never became Comstock, where he lived a full life and died peacefully. It suggests that somewhere, in some reality, her sacrifice led to happiness. This ending is both beautiful and heartbreaking. Elizabeth, who spent her entire existence trying to fix the damage caused by Comstock's ambitions, finally succeeds but cannot witness the fruit of her success. She dies in Rapture, killed by a man using her own creation against her, knowing that her death is necessary but unable to see the good that will come from it. She must take it on faith, the very thing Comstock twisted into justification for atrocity, that somewhere, somehow, her choice mattered. Burial at Sea transforms BioShock from a series of separate games into a unified meditation on choice, consequence, and the patterns that repeat across different contexts. It suggests that the philosophical failures of Rapture and Columbia are not isolated incidents, but expressions of deeper human tendencies. We build utopias on different foundations, but they crumble in similar ways because we are the constant in the equation. The DLC also provides a final comment on the nature of redemption. Comstock fled to Rapture trying to escape his guilt, using Adam to forget what he had done. But forgetting is not the same as atoning. He carried his corruption across dimensions, and it manifested in new forms even when he didn't remember its source. True redemption, the DLC suggests, requires facing what you've done, accepting the consequences, and choosing differently even when it costs everything. Elizabeth's journey from tower to tomb, from imprisoned innocence to conscious self-sacrifice, represents the series' most complete exploration of freedom and agency. She starts with no freedom despite immense power, learns to use that power to navigate infinite realities, and finally chooses to limit herself to save others. At every stage, she moves toward greater agency, even as her options narrow, until the final choice where she has complete understanding and chooses the one path that ends in her own death. The connection between cities also raises questions about inevitability. If Columbia and Rapture follow similar trajectories despite opposite foundations, what does that say about the human capacity for building better societies? Are we doomed to repeat these patterns, or does the fact that Jack can choose to save the little sisters, that Elizabeth can choose self-sacrifice, that even within failed utopias individual choices can resist the tide, suggest that hope remains? The failures of Rapture and Columbia, while superficially different, stem from the same fundamental error: the belief that a single philosophical principle, rigorously applied, can create a perfect society. Both Ryan and Comstock made the mistake of confusing a useful insight with a complete world view, taking one aspect of human nature and treating it as the whole truth. Ryan was not wrong that individual freedom and achievement matter. He was wrong in thinking they were the only things that matter. The capacity for innovation, creativity, and progress does increase when people have the freedom to pursue their visions. But humans are also social creatures who need community, who depend on cooperation, who sometimes require support when they fail. Ryan's philosophy had no room for these needs, treating them as weakness to be overcome rather than features to be integrated. The result was a system that worked brilliantly for those who succeeded but had no mechanism to help those who failed. In Rapture, if you were talented, driven, and lucky, the possibilities were endless. But if you were ordinary, if you needed help, if circumstances conspired against you, the city had nothing to offer but contempt. This created a underclass that Ryan's ideology denied could exist, and from that denial came the conditions for Fontaine's rise and the Civil War. Rapture's collapse was not inevitable from the moment of its founding, but it became inevitable the moment Ryan refused to acknowledge that his philosophy was incomplete. When inequality emerged, he interpreted it as proof of differential merit rather than systemic flaw. When Adam created addicts, he saw weak individuals rather than dangerous technology needing regulation. When Fontaine challenged him, he abandoned his principles to maintain power, revealing that his commitment to freedom was always conditional on people using that freedom in ways he approved. Columbia's failure followed a different path to the same destination. Comstock was not wrong that communities need shared values and that tradition can provide meaning. He was wrong in absolutizing American nationalism and white supremacy into cosmic truth, wrong in using divine authority to justify oppression, wrong in believing that purity and righteousness could be enforced through power. The racism at Columbia's heart was not a peripheral flaw, but a load-bearing pillar of the entire structure. Comstock's theology required racial hierarchy to function. If all people were equal in God's eyes, then Columbia had no special divine mission. The oppression was not incidental but essential, which meant that any reform would threaten the city's entire reason for existence. The Vox Populi rebellion was therefore inevitable, not because the oppressed always rebel, but because Columbia's structure created conditions where peaceful change was impossible. Comstock could not compromise with the Vox because their demands threatened the theological foundation of the city. The Vox could not accept incremental reform because the system was designed to prevent their full participation. Violence became the only language both sides could speak. Columbia also collapsed under the weight of its internal contradictions, a city that preached tradition and divine order while depending on cutting-edge quantum physics, a prophet who claimed visions from God while using technology to spy on alternate timelines, a society that celebrated American values while creating a floating police state. These tensions could be papered over during good times, but became fault lines when stress increased. Both cities also failed because they were led by men who could not tolerate genuine opposition. Ryan and Comstock each built their cities as monuments to their own philosophies, and they interpreted any challenge to those philosophies as personal betrayal. Neither could separate criticism of their ideas from attacks on their person. Neither could accept that they might be wrong about fundamental assumptions. This narcissism, disguised as philosophical conviction, prevented both men from making necessary course corrections. When evidence emerged that their systems were not working as intended, they doubled down rather than adapted. When people suffered under their rules, they blamed the people rather than the rules. When rebellion came, they met it with force rather than dialogue. The tragedy is that both cities contained the resources and brilliant minds needed to address their problems. Rapture had scientists who could have developed solutions to Adam addiction if allowed to, prioritize public health over profit. Columbia had engineers who could have designed more equitable systems if freed from theological constraints. But the ideological rigidity of both cities prevented them from using their capabilities to solve their self-created problems. Both cities also demonstrate the danger of exodus mentalities, of believing that the solution to the world's problems is to separate from the world rather than engage with it. Ryan built Rapture to escape the parasites and kings he saw dominating surface society. Comstock built Columbia to rise above the Sodom below. Both rejected engagement with existing society in favour of creating pure spaces free from contamination, but you cannot escape human nature by changing location or philosophy. The same tendencies toward inequality, exploitation, and violence that Ryan and Comstock saw in surface society emerged in their underwater and aerial paradises, because those tendencies are not products of particular political systems, but features of human behaviour that any system must account for and constrain. The city's physical isolation also prevented the kind of external pressure that can force positive change. In the surface world, no matter how authoritarian a government becomes, it must still contend with other nations, international opinion, trade relationships, and the possibility of citizens leaving. Rapture and Columbia, isolated by water and cloud, faced no such constraints. They were totalizing systems where exit was controlled and external influence minimized. This isolation meant that when things went wrong, they went catastrophically wrong. There was no gradual pressure toward reform, no neighbouring societies offering alternative models, no international institutions demanding basic standards of human rights. There was only the internal logic of the system, playing out to its terminal conclusion. The use of technology in both cities reveals another dimension of their failure. Rapture's ADAM and Columbia's quantum mechanics were presented as tools of liberation, ways to transcend human limitations and achieve greatness. But both became mechanisms of control and sources of conflict. Technology is not neutral. It amplifies existing power structures and can entrench inequality as easily as it enables progress. In Rapture, genetic modification created a biological arms race, where those with resources could purchase advantages that compounded over time. In Columbia, quantum mechanics allowed Comstock to claim prophetic knowledge and create weapons of unprecedented power. In both cases, the technology made the powerful more powerful and the vulnerable more vulnerable, exactly the opposite of the liberation it promised. The final similarity between both cities' failures is that they destroyed themselves not through external attack but internal collapse. Rapture fell to civil war between its own factions. Columbia tore itself apart through revolution and counter-revolution. Neither city was conquered by surface nations or brought down by outside forces. They imploded from their own contradictions, consumed by the tensions built into their foundations. This suggests that the philosophical failure was not in the execution but in the concept. Any attempt to build a perfect society on a single principle, whether individual freedom or divine nationalism, will fail because humans are too complex to be reduced to a single dimension. We need freedom, but also community, tradition, but also progress, individual achievement, but also collective support. Any philosophy that denies or minimizes some essential aspect of human nature will create a society that cannot sustain itself. Ryan and Comstock were not fools or monsters, at least not initially. They were visionaries who saw real problems in the world and proposed radical solutions. Their tragedy was that they fell in love with their own solutions, unable to see that every answer creates new questions, every solution generates new problems. The perfect can be the enemy of the good when perfection is defined so rigidly that it cannot bend without breaking. BioShock's narrative across all games returns repeatedly to questions of choice and determinism, asking whether our decisions matter if patterns repeat across contexts and realities. The answer the series offers is complex and unsatisfying in the best way. Yes, choices matter, but they matter within constraints, and understanding those constraints does not free us from responsibility for what we choose. The constants in BioShock are not just narrative elements, but thematic truths. There is always a city, always a man, always a lighthouse. But more fundamentally, there are patterns in human behavior that recur regardless of the specific ideology used to justify them. The powerful exploit the vulnerable. Utopian visions corrupt into nightmares. Technology promised as liberation becomes a tool of control. These patterns appear in Rapture in Columbia and implicitly in any similar attempt to create perfection through ideology. The variables are where freedom expresses itself. Jack can choose to save or harvest the little sisters. Booker can choose whether to accept baptism. Elizabeth can choose to drown Comstock across all timelines. These choices don't break the broader patterns. They happen within them, but they matter enormously for the individuals involved and for the smaller patterns that they create. This framework rejects both pure determinism and pure free will in favor of something more nuanced. We are not blank slates free to become anything, nor are we rigidly programmed machines following scripts. We are beings with tendencies and constraints who nonetheless must choose within the parameters that biology, society, and history have established. The choosing is real even if the options are limited. The "Would You Kindly" revelation in BioShock makes this explicit. The player character has been following commands the entire game, but learning this truth creates a kind of meta-freedom. We cannot change what Jack has done, but we can change how we interpret it and what we do moving forward. The conditioning explains our past actions, but knowledge of the conditioning gives us power over future choices. This mirrors how understanding the broader patterns in BioShock's universe functions. Recognizing that cities built on ideological purity tend to fail does not mean we cannot try to build better societies. It means we should build them with humility, with recognition of human complexity, with systems that can adapt when problems emerge. The pattern is not destiny but warning, information we can use to make better choices. The series also suggests that meaning comes not from breaking free of all constraints, but from how we respond within them. Elizabeth cannot prevent her kidnapping, or the existence of Comstock across all initial timelines, but she can choose what to do with the power that resulted from that trauma. She can choose to use her unique position to prevent future suffering. The meaning of her life comes from that choice, not from whether the choice was predetermined or free in some absolute sense. Similarly, Jack's choice regarding the Little Sisters matters not because it changes the fundamental nature of Rapture, or reverses all the harm done by Ryan and Fontaine. It matters because it determines whether he becomes another exploiter, or breaks the pattern in one small but significant way. The good ending shows the Little Sisters growing up happy, living full lives because one person chose differently than the system expected. This raises the question of what constitutes a good ending in a world where patterns repeat. The best ending for Jack involves saving the Little Sisters and living quietly with them as they grow. He does not rebuild Rapture, does not reform its systems, does not prevent future disasters. He simply saves a handful of children and gives them the childhood they were denied. In the scope of everything that went wrong in Rapture, it is a small victory. But the series suggests that small victories are what we have, that large-scale ideological transformations tend toward catastrophe, while individual acts of compassion create genuine good. Ryan tried to transform all of society and created hell. Jack simply tried to save a few children and created happiness for them. The scale of ambition is inverse to the reliability of positive outcome. This is not an argument for quietism or for abandoning efforts to improve society. Rather, it's a caution against the kind of totalizing thinking that Ryan and Comstock engaged in, the belief that if we could just implement the right system, if we could just get everyone to follow the right principles, utopia would follow. The series suggests that partial solutions, compromises, and incremental improvements are not second-best options, but the only options that respect human complexity. The lighthouse metaphor that frames each game carries this meaning. Lighthouses mark dangerous passages, warn of hazards, guide towards safety. But they do not control where ships go or guarantee safe passage. They provide information and orientation, leaving the ultimate choices to those navigating. BioShock's lighthouses mark the beginning of journeys into ideological extremes, warning us of the rocks ahead while acknowledging that we must still choose our course. The series' treatment of violence also reflects this nuanced view of choice and consequence. Jack and Booker are both capable of extraordinary violence, and the games require players to engage in that violence to progress. But the narrative never lets us be comfortable with it. The violence is acknowledged as traumatic, as morally complicated, as something that damages the one who commits it even when it's necessary. This discomfort is intentional. BioShock wants us to think about the violence we enact in games, to question the power fantasies that most shooters uncritically embrace. Yes, you have the power to kill everyone in your path, but should you? And what does it cost you to do so? The splicers are tragic figures, victims of addiction and a failed system. Killing them is often necessary for survival, but it's never glorious. The philosophical failures of Rapture and Columbia ultimately point to the failure of philosophy itself when disconnected from human reality. Both Ryan and Comstock treated their ideologies as more real than the people who lived under them. When reality contradicted the philosophy, they adjusted reality rather than adjusting the philosophy. This is the error that dooms all utopian projects, prioritizing the idea over the lived experience. The series does not offer a clear alternative ideology. It does not say that democracy is better than objectivism or American nationalism, though it certainly critiques both. Instead, it suggests that any ideology becomes dangerous when held too rigidly, when believers cannot tolerate contradiction or compromise, when the system becomes more important than the people it supposedly serves. What BioShock offers instead of an alternative ideology is a set of principles for thinking about society and choice. Recognize patterns but don't be imprisoned by them. Understand constraints but choose within them. Acknowledge complexity rather than reducing humans to a single dimension. Distrust anyone who claims to have all the answers. Value small goods over grand visions. Accept that perfection is impossible and that trying to force it leads to disaster. These are not sexy principles. They don't inspire the same passion as no gods, no kings, only man, or the divine mission of American exceptionalism, but they might actually help us avoid building cities that drown their residents, or rain fire on the world below. They might help us create societies that are messy, imperfect, but sustainable and capable of learning from mistakes. The closing scene of BioShock Infinite, with multiple Elizabeths drowning Booker in baptismal waters, is both ending and beginning. It ends the cycle of Comstock's existence across infinite timelines, but it also begins the possibility of timelines where different choices lead to different outcomes, where patterns might still repeat but with variations that matter. The final image of a door closing and cutting to black suggests both closure and opening. Some doors must close for others to open. Some possibilities must be foreclosed to prevent catastrophic outcomes. But in choosing which doors to close, we also choose which futures become possible. Elizabeth closes the door on Comstock and in doing so opens the door to timelines where Anna DeWitt grows up with her father. BioShock's lore across all games constructs a universe where grand ideologies fail, but individual choices echo across realities, where cities built as monuments to philosophical purity become tombs of those philosophies, where the attempt to escape human nature through isolation only concentrates its worst aspects, where power and certainty corrupt more reliably than any particular political or religious system. But it also constructs a universe where small acts of compassion create genuine good, where understanding patterns gives us tools to resist them, where even predetermined outcomes leave room for meaningful choice, where the recognition of our limits becomes the foundation for wisdom rather than despair. The philosophical failures of Rapture and Columbia teach us not that we should abandon the attempt to create better societies, but that we should approach that attempt with humility. Not that freedom and tradition have no value, but that neither is sufficient alone. Not that choices do not matter, but that they matter in more complex ways than we often acknowledge. In the end, BioShock asks us to think critically about the ideologies we encounter, the choices we make, and the patterns we participate in. It asks us to recognize that every utopia contains the seeds of dystopia, that every simple answer to complex questions is probably wrong, and that the best we can do is choose thoughtfully within our constraints while remaining open to the possibility that we might be wrong. These cities are gone now, drowned or scattered across quantum probabilities, but the questions they raised remain, echoing through the water and clouds, asking us to consider what we would build, what we would sacrifice, and whether we would have the wisdom to stop before our dreams became nightmares. The lighthouse still stands, marking the passage, offering no guarantees, leaving the choice to those who approach its light.